In June 1974, administrative supervisors was baffled by a sudden increase in patient deaths. During a recent 2-week period, 12 heart patients on the coronary care unit floor died unexpectedly. Although many of those 12 men and women were elderly, all of them were in recovery, and the prognosis for each of them was very good. In those days, Petersburg General Hospital was a 7-story hospital with 440 beds that served Pittsburgh, Hopewell, and Colonial Heights. A modern coronary care unit occupied one entire floor of the hospital. It was divided into 2 sections, one for intensive care and critically ill patients, and a large section for recuperative care. When hospital administrators and doctors examined the medical charts for all 12, they could find no logical explanation for why they died. Although their prognosis was good, it was as if their hearts just stopped working suddenly and for no reason. But 12 dead in 2 weeks was statistically impossible. They had to keep looking for a cause, something they all had in common. They found the first one by looking at the time of death. All 12 died between 11 p.m. and 7 in the morning. At the hospital, 11 o'clock at night to 7 o'clock in the morning was known by all as the graveyard shift. When they cross-referenced employee schedules with the date and time of date for those patients, they found one name that came up all 12 times: Lee Roy Hargrave Jr. Going back farther, they found even more instances where Hargrave was on duty the same night other patients died suddenly and unexpectedly. Not only was he there on those same nights, Hargrave was the one who called for a code blue in most of those cases. In 1974, Hargrave was a 21-year-old nurse's aide who once dreamed of becoming a doctor before he flunked out of college his second semester. His high school friends and college classmates who knew him described him as a nice young man, but a loner who kept to himself mostly. They recalled he was interested in the occult, supernatural, and the Salem witch trials. During his short time at Randolph-Macon College in 1971 to 1972, a small nodule of unknown origin had grown on the left side of Hargrave's neck. Doctors did not know what it was and didn't seem to think it was serious. However, Hargrave told several classmates he had leukemia and was dying. To encourage that belief, Hargrave had fainting spells, missed classes often for medical reasons, and wore long-sleeve shirts to cover up rubber tubes supposedly attached to his arms. However, this just attracted more attention since the tubes were clearly visible, extending beyond his shirt sleeve. In a 1974 interview, Hargrave's parent told a reporter from the Pittsburgh Progress Index their son did not have leukemia, but he apparently led others to believe that he was dying. Greenfield wrote in his Sob Sister feature story. Greenfield dodged an explanation to why he did it, but others speculated Hargrave lied about having terminal cancer to cover up for his poor academic performance. In high school, he earned a D and an F over 2 semesters in chemistry, an important subject to learn for anyone wanting to become a medical doctor. His teacher described him as a quitter. When things got too tough, Hargrave would stop trying. During the summer of 1971, after he graduated high school and before attending the small private college in Ashland, Virginia, Hargrave found a part-time job as a nurse's aide at Petersburg General Hospital, where Hargrave returned home from Ashland in 1972. He also returned to his old part-time position. In Greenfield's article from the Petersburg Progress Index, he wrote that 1972 was a difficult time for Hargrave's family. Young Roy's mother was recently diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and the plant where Roy Sr. was employed was having problems. Work was unsteady, which meant his paycheck was unsteady, and his wife, Mary C. Hargrave, needed medical treatment. The bills were piling up. Young Hargrave was needed at home. His dreams of returning to college to become a doctor was placed on indefinite hold. Roy worked as a part-time nursing assistant for 2 more years before the hospital offered him a full-time position in April of 1974, and like many new hires to shift work, Roy was assigned to the graveyard shift, 11 p.m. to 7 o'clock in the morning. A few weeks later, patient mortality on the coronary unit slowly began to increase. Then, it suddenly spiked when 12 patients died during a 2-week period in May and June 1974. That was the unheard of circumstances that caught the attention of hospital supervisors. Their internal review narrowed it down to Hargrave as having some sort of connection to those deaths. But this was a hospital investigation, not a police one. They wanted to be 100% confident in any action they took. During those last 2 weeks in June, Roy was under surveillance by his superiors. High-ranking nurses, doctors, and others were watching him carefully. However, not carefully enough, unfortunately. During the last week of June, 5 more non-risk patients died overnight while Roy was on duty. They included Edward Harris, 64, June the 23rd, Martha Jane Avery, 80, June the 25th, Thomas Wesley Ray, 85, June the 29th, and Josephine L. Thomas, 73, June the 30th. It was the last one that got him. Her death erased any doubts with hospital staff, who were stunned by her sudden and inexplicable death. A crime magazine later reported retired school teacher Josephine L. Thomas was in really very good physical condition and very strong for her age. Staff members did not regard her as particularly ill. She would soon be released. A nurse who later testified against him said that within 2 minutes of the drug-induced seizure which ended Miss Thomas's life, Roy had gone down the hall of the progressive unit toward the patient's room, and then was the only employee in that section of the unit. Looking back over the records, hospital investigators calculated that Roy called for 26 of the last 31 code blue alerts. When a heart patient was dying or dead, he was the one who sounded the alarm 84% of the time. It was another statistical impossibility. Later that morning, Roy was laid off due to staff cutbacks, and the hospital had told him that was the reason they laid him off. An investigation into the unexplained deaths progressed quietly, carried out by the Virginia Commonwealth Attorney and his assistant, as well as the state medical examiner and toxicologist. With the further cooperation of staff members at the hospital, law enforcement would not be involved until the very end. Blood and tissue samples from Josephine Thomas were sent to the state lab, where it was handled by the chief toxicologist. The results from the gas chromatograph revealed the killer's secret weapon. Thomas died from a lethal dose of lidocaine, a drug that depresses activity of the heart muscle to the point it will stop moving. The 73-year-old retired schoolteacher was never prescribed lidocaine. In fact, a cardiologist would have no reason to prescribe a heart patient a medication that would lead to heart failure. Roy was indicted and arrested on August the 14th for the murder of Josephine Thomas. Over the next 2 months, the body of more patients who died that June were exhumed. The test revealed 5 of them died from lethal doses of lidocaine. Roy was charged with first-degree murder in those cases as well. They included Edward Harris, 64, Martha Avery, 84, Thomas Wesley Ray, 85, Robert Weish, and Leonard Hudson Sr. He pled not guilty to all of the charges. Following 35 days of mental observation in a state hospital, in which his letters home to his parents were made public in newspapers, Roy's trial for the first-degree murder of Josephine Thomas began on May the 3rd, 1975. The case against him was overwhelming, with 29 prosecution witnesses testifying over 6 days. When Roy took the stand in his own defense, the prosecutor's cross-examination boxed him into a corner, and most of his answers consisted of, "I don't know," and "I don't recall." When asked if he had once told his cellmate that he had killed elderly people for kicks, his answer was, "I don't remember." "You deny it, or you don't remember?" the prosecution asked again. "I don't remember," Roy repeated. In addition to hospital co-workers who testified they witnessed Roy doing or saying things, suspicious things, 2 male patients also testified against him. In 2 separate incidents, Roy entered their room with no explanation and asked them to roll over on their side. Doing so directed their attention away from their IV drip, where Hargrave would inject something into the tube. In those separate incidents, both men were suspicious of Roy, protested his presence, and turned to look to see what he was doing when they saw him inject the unknown substance into their IV. A short time after he left those rooms, both men said they suffered medical complications that required the attention of a physician and several nurses. On May the 8th, after only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Leroy Hargrave Jr. guilty, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison. Shortly after court recessed, Roy met with his attorney and parents in a small witness room to discuss an appeal. With a guard standing nearby, Roy entered a restroom and then returned 30 seconds later. After a few minutes went by, he collapsed on his mother. Roy was taken to the hospital and treated for a drug overdose. When he was in the bathroom, he swallowed approximately 30 pills of Valium and Elavil, an antidepressant. The medication belonged to his mother, who took them for her multiple sclerosis and depression. As we know, it is almost impossible to overdose on Valium or antidepressants, so he was never in any real danger. In 1975, a sentence of life in prison did not mean life in prison. Roy's life sentence actually meant he would be eligible for parole in 15 years. He was never tried for the other 5 murders. In November of 2009, after serving 35 years in prison, the Virginia Parole Board granted parole to Leroy Hargrave Jr. According to the laws in place at the time of his conviction, he was quietly released on December the 31st, 2009. The parole board did not notify the media they had released a suspected serial killer into the community until 2 months later. Over the last 21 years, only one newspaper in the country has even reported on this suspected serial killer, and that is the same newspaper that serves the community he affected the most, the Petersburg Progress Index. Their first article on Roy's release was published 60 days later on May the 4th, 2010. Their front page headline story retold the story for readers and also shed more light on Roy's peculiar hobbies. He had actually acknowledged at the trial that he had an interest in communicating with the dead, holding Ouija board sessions in lieu of beer parties. He also kept a list of the people who died in the coronary care unit. A neighbor and close friend of Roy told the media during the trial that Roy had a long-standing interest in the occult and believed he had supernatural powers given to him by the forces of evil. Others who knew Roy described him as a loner and confirmed his interest in the supernatural. But his mother told a reporter at the time that Roy was a normal young man who especially enjoyed the little old ladies when he worked at the hospital. The March the 4th, 2010 article had no contact information for Roy, who was released by the parole board, and the reporter was unable to locate the then 56-year-old. The Virginia Parole Board assigned him to their District 41, which includes Hanover and Caroline counties. In 2010, it wasn't clear why the parole board sent him to that particular district. The answer to that question came in 2012 when Roy's father died on March the 18th in Ashland, Virginia, which is Hanover County. After serving in World War II, Leroy Hargrave Sr. graduated from Randolph-Macon County College in Ashland sometime in the early 1950s, the same school Roy Jr. was separated from for academic deficiencies. Roy Sr. loved his son and always believed in his innocence. He was to say as much in death. In his short obituary, it reads, Hargrave Lee Roy Sr., 86, of Ashland, passed away on Sunday, March the 18th, 2012. He is survived by his wife of 61 years, Mary C. Hargrave, a son, Leroy Hargrave Jr., and his brother, Colonel C. E. Hargrave. He is also survived by his special children, Nikki and Mercedes, which is his cats. Mr. Hargrave was a U.S. Marine vet serving at Chema during World War II. Funeral services were private at Forest Lawn Cemetery. In 2015, Roy Sr.'s brother mentioned in his obituary as a retired Army colonel that died in 2015. In his obituary, sister-in-law Mary C. Hargrave of Ashland and nephew Leroy Hargrave Jr. of Ashland are listed as his survivors. This was the last time suspect serial killer Roy Hargrave Jr.'s name is posted on the internet or in digital newspaper archive services. There is also no record of either one of them passing away since listed in the 2015 obituary. If this mother and son are still alive, they are likely living together in their Ashland family home. Although this case received national coverage in 1974 and 75, it appears as if only a handful of people today remember this angel of death suspected serial killer who was once charged with 5 other murders and could have been responsible for 12 to 26 victims total. This is the New York Daily News article, front page, the entire page, Sunday, June the 30th, 1991. Horror in the hospitals. They were old and sick, men, women, black and white. They came from Petersburg and the surrounding rural area of South Virginia to get life-giving care. But something was decidedly wrong at Petersburg General Hospital. The people were dying at a frightful rate. During June of 1974, in the hospital's coronary care unit, 31 patients had gone bad from cardiac arrest. Not all died, though death does stalk a coronary care unit. Still, in the last 2 weeks in June, deaths were called alarming. By month's end, 12 had died, nearly double the average monthly rate. 6 of the 12 died from an overdose of lidocaine, a drug routinely administered in small doses to tranquilize and regulate abnormal hearts. It was an inexpensive and widely used medication. All of the victims had intravenous feeding tubes going into veins in their arm. Officials believed the lidocaine was injected by needle into the tubes unnoticed by the victims. The purpose, murder. During this trauma, nurse Joyce Lee Andrews became uneasy about one of the aides, Leroy Hargrave Jr. of Colonial Heights. Hargrave was 21, clean-cut, with long dark hair. He wore glasses and he had a jolly disposition. Said Andrews, "I told my supervisors I was suspicious, but I had no proof, and I kept telling myself we were just going through a bad time." Hargrave worked the 11 to 7 shift in the coronary care wing. The patients liked him. He would pop his smiling face into a room and ask if he could offer a glass of water or fix a pillow. He was one of the hardest workers here, said patient Harvey Leaston. Nurses seemed divided on Roy. To some, he was a pest. He enjoyed teasing them, and he always asked questions about medications and the electronic machines used to monitor heart patients. Hargrave insisted he wanted to be a doctor. The son of a tobacco company supervisor, Hargrave graduated from high school in 1971, 22nd in a class of 300. He was active in science, French, and drama clubs. He entered Randolph-Macon College, where he had only a B average in the first semester. Family members explained he was distracted because his mother, Mary, came down with multiple sclerosis. With medical bills mounting, Roy quit school and went to work as an orderly at Petersburg General. In January 1974, he was promoted to nursing assistant and moved to coronary care. That April, he went on the graveyard shift. Hargrave was screened for the job, but one facet of his personality was missed. When a teen, he became fascinated with witchcraft and the occult. He denied interest in seances, which he thought was sacrilegious, but acknowledged fiddling with the Ouija board. Eventually, Andrew's suspicion grew stronger, and she and several other nurses tried to keep an eye on Hargrave. On the night of June the 29th, Andrews found Roy yelling at patient Thomas Ray, 85, a farmer, admitted the day before complaining of trouble breathing. When intravenous feeding was ordered for Ray, Roy seemed pleased, Andrews said later. She quoted him as saying, "I hope the same thing won't happen that happened to the last patient you put on an IV." A half an hour later, Ray was dead, and a vial of lidocaine was missing from the medicine chest. After that night, I was no longer suspicious. I was sure, Andrew said. The next night, several nurses kept tabs on Roy, but there was a distraction. A disoriented patient wandered into the hall, and Roy left, reportedly to fetch a restraint. But an aide, Marilyn Wells, sitting out of sight, said she saw Roy come out of a room where lidocaine was kept and walk in the direction of the room of Josephine Thomas, 73, a retired teacher. Thomas, with arthritis and a weak heart, had arrived the day before. She was reportedly resting comfortably at about midnight, but at 1 a.m., June the 30th, Roy said he was passing her room and saw her in a seizure. He tried to resuscitate, but Thomas died before a nurse entered the room. As he and the nurse, Barbara Ferguson, wheeled the body from the room, Roy asked, "Why do I always seem to be the one that finds the bodies?" Later, as they wrapped the body for a mortician, Hargrave said, "I don't know if I can take much more of this." It was the 12th body he had wrapped in 3 weeks. Hospital officials decided they would not take much more of this either. Roy was quietly fired, while Commonwealth Attorney J. Thomas S. Wyatt began a secret probe. On June the 15th, 1974, Hargrave was indicted in the murder of Thomas. After being exhumed and autopsies, Hargrave was indicted in 5 more deaths: Ray, Harris, Hudson, Avery, and Welch. The community was jolted by the news. Roy's parents refused to believe it. His mother said, "There's no way Roy could have murdered them. He wouldn't even kill a bug in the house. He'd catch bugs and put them outside." After psychiatric examination at Petersburg Central State Hospital, Roy was pronounced competent to stand trial. On May 3, 1975, he appeared before Circuit Court Judge Oliver A. Poland and a jury in the death of Thomas. Assistant Commonwealth Attorney James D. Alton obtained court approval over defense objection to introduce evidence in the Ray case to show Roy had motive, intent, and a scheme to murder people in the hospital. The case was circumstantial. No one had seen the defendant inject anyone. Dee Alton said Ray's death occurred on the same floor and that Ray and Thomas were getting medication intravenously. He said Roy was the only common denominator on the floor and he had latest access to the Ray and Thomas rooms. In retrospect, argued Dee Alton, whenever Roy had a nut off, nobody died. Andrews told her story, as did Wells. Defense lawyer Baker contended that if the nurses were suspicious of Roy, they never should have left him on the floor. Roy took the stand and denied injecting the fatal doses. He insisted he never violated hospital rules against aides giving medication. Dee Alton called ex-patients Richard Bird, 43, and Etta Jones, 52, to refute Roy. Both testified they had seen him approaching their beds. The woman said he was holding a syringe. Both patients passed out but later recovered. On May the 7th, 1975, the jury found Roy guilty of murder and he was sentenced to life in prison. Other charges were dropped in view of the life term. When Roy got the verdict, he showed no emotion. He simply asked to go to the lavatory for a drink of water. An hour later, he collapsed and was rushed to a Richmond hospital suffering from an overdose of amphetamines. Doctors saved him. They said he had taken some 20 pills. Under Virginia law, Roy could appeal for parole, having served 15 years. He is still doing time in Southampton Correctional Center in Capron, Virginia. A spokesman for the Commonwealth Corrections Department said no parole hearing is scheduled. Do keep in mind that that was an article that was written June the 30th, 1991 in the New York Daily Times. This would be a photo of Roy when he collapsed, when he took the pills and collapsed on his mother. This would be him on the stretcher, headed to the hospital where he was fine. If you are from Petersburg, Virginia, and you have heard of this story, drop us a comment and let us know. It does say that he does not have an obituary, so obviously Roy Hargrave is still alive, and he is free. Have a wonderful night and the sweetest of dreams. Good night, everyone. This is UnJustified.